Are you looking for a bunch of research-backed teaching hacks that are going to help you boost student learning and engagement? Well, if that's you, you've come to the right place, because in today's episode, we're going to be going through a plethora of research-informed strategies that are going to help boost student learning and engagement in the classroom. But we're going to do more than just a laundry list of strategies. We're going to put them into a coherent framework that's going to help you organize your thinking around how to best implement and discuss those research-informed strategies to help student learning. And if you want to stick around to the end, there's a bit of a bonus strategy in there that is a very powerful strategy to help students become their own teachers. So if that interests you, stick around for the bonus content. G'day and welcome to the Powerful Learning community. My name's Luke Rowe. I'm a researcher and a lecturer who specializes in the learning sciences and evidence-based teaching. And in today's episode, we're going to be going through a number of evidence-based teaching hacks that are going to help boost student learning and engagement in your classroom. We're also going to put those into a coherent framework that'll help us organize our thoughts so that we're more readily able to implement them effectively in the classroom. So let's have a look at this framework now. Now this may look a little bit complicated while it's on screen, but trust me, hang around, we'll go through it and it'll make sense as we work through all of this detail. Now if you look to the right of screen, you'll see the words transfer and contextualization. Now these two variables operate in an inverse way. So as you have certain teaching strategies and learning strategies that are more context specific, that is, for example, a very specific mathematics concept like learning functions or probability and polynomial equations, something like that, those strategies aren't going to transfer to other broader contexts, like doing art in the humanities or something like that. Then you've got the transfer element, right? So this is determining the level of contextualization of these strategies will determine the successful transfer of those learning strategies. So the more context specific a learning strategy is, the less likely it's going to transfer to more general or adjacent or opposite fields or domains of knowledge. Right, so that hopefully makes some intuitive sense there. That then gives rise to this triple M framework, the macro, meso, micro level intervention. Now, if this isn't making much sense, stick with me because we're going to unpack this slowly but surely as we go, and it's going to start to make sense. The light bulbs are going to switch on. So stick with me. We'll dig into the framework with concrete examples and it's all going to make sense soon. So of course, one of the best ways to understand each of the layers of this triple M framework, the macro, the meso, the micro interventions, is to give you examples. In the macro framework, the macro level interventions, we've got two sets of strategies or interventions that we can point to. Rosenshine's instructional model and Gagne's 9 events of instruction. Let's have a closer look. So the late and great Baruch Rosenshine published a couple of really key papers in this area that articulated his framework for teaching in all classrooms across schools. He looked at this in relation to 10 different research-backed strategies that teachers could use on any or most occasions. And I'll just read a quote from one of his more recent publications before he passed away in 2017. So the principles of instruction that he refers to are these. This includes 10 research-based principles of instruction, along with suggestions for classroom practice. These principles come from 3 sources: research in cognitive science, research on master teachers, and research on cognitive supports. The fact that instructional ideas from 3 different sources supplement and complement each other gives us faith in the validity of these findings. Right, so that's corroborating the findings. It strengthens the validity of a particular finding, and that's what he's arguing for here with these instructional practices. So what are they? So Rosenshine described 10 essential practices and another 7 additional practices, instructional practices. Let's look at the 10 first, and then we'll look at the other 7 remaining instructional practices there. The first one there is daily review. So you're starting to say, when a student walks in the classroom, here's a bit of a review of what we learned last time and a bit of an overview of what's to come today. So you're connecting the prior learning to the present learning and the goals of the lesson. And that bridges into point number 2, where you present new material using small steps. So we're anchoring on the prior learning and then starting to take baby steps into this new material and introducing these new ideas to our students. Then of course we ask questions. We start to bring the students into the discussion and start to get some feedback on how they're thinking about these new ideas. Then we can provide models to our students where we can show them how these ideas look in practice, we can show them what they're applicable to, and we can model how to use those ideas ourselves. Then the next part is to guide the student in independent practice themselves. And this could be some kind of faded scaffolding principle where it's an I do as the teacher, we do as in I do it with you, and then you do. So it goes from the teacher to a shared experience to an independent learning task. And that would also be consistent with Vygotsky's zone of proximal development, where somebody is going to get help right at the edges or just beyond the edges of their zone of proximal development, and that is the things that they can achieve independently without support. You as a teacher will come in there and help them beyond that. Then you've got to check for student understanding, because how do we know that a student is learning during their practice unless we check for that understanding? We want to see that what they know now is different to what they knew 5 minutes ago when they started the activity. Then once the student's on the right track, we want them to continue to practice until they reach a high level of success. And that's very important, because if they're still making errors and they're practicing those errors over and over again, they're actually instilling the errors into their thinking, their habitual patterns of thinking, and they might learn the incorrect information. So we want to have them achieve a high success rate. It also gives them confidence and it boosts their self-efficacy for future learning. So it gets this positive feedback loop happening. Then, of course, we look for extension opportunities and provide scaffolds for difficult tasks. We stretch their thinking and have them start to link into the future lessons that we're looking towards, or the bigger ideas that we're wanting to stretch them towards. Then get them for independent practice, right? You start to hand over the teaching responsibilities to the students so they can become their own teachers, and give them that responsibility to teach themselves. Then that final point number 10, is a weekly and monthly review. And the reason why Rosenshine's pointed to that is because so rarely do we revisit material that's covered in the classroom. Often we teach the content and we say, our work is done here, and we move on. Almost like we would with a book chapter. We say, we've read that, I know this, I can move on. But that's not how the brain works. We need multiple exposures, multiple meaningful exposures to information to even start to comprehend and retain that information. But then, of course, it's not just the input opportunities, it's then opportunities to express what you know and to apply that knowledge. It's retrieving it that actually causes us to become better at remembering it. So these opportunities have to be revisited over and over again for the learning to consolidate over the long term. Now, I mentioned before that Rosenshine actually had an additional 7 principles of instruction. And so you can see the additional detail is put in there. I won't cover them. You can pause the screen if you want a closer look at those. Now let's go a little deeper into history and look at Robert Gagne's model of instructional design. In 1965, Robert Gagne published a book called The Conditions of Learning. And in that book, The Conditions of Learning, he talked about this idea of a model of instructional design, a generic model of instructional design that all learning and teaching sequences should follow. Let's take a closer look at one of the publications that followed some of his work in the medical sciences. So they said that Gagne's model of instructional design is based on the information processing model of the mental events that occur when adults are presented with various stimuli, and focuses on the learning outcomes and how to arrange specific instructional events to achieve those outcomes. Applying Gagne's 9-step model is an excellent way to ensure an effective and systematic learning program, as it gives structure to the lesson plans and a holistic view to the teaching. And of course, one of the ways to really test out if ideas are effective is to put them in applied context, right? So they're not just theoretically good, but they're practically good ideas. And when we start to see that surgeons are using these instructional frameworks to teach surgery to other colleagues and to more junior doctors, we can get a good sense that these instructional practices are fairly sound and fairly robust in how they're arranged and the research and practical element of them. So what are these mysterious 9 events of instruction that Gagne was talking about? Let's have a look. So he outlined those 9 basic events of instruction. There was 3 in the before learning event, 3 during the learning event, and 3 after the learning event. What do I mean by that? Well, there's gain attention, inform the learner of the objectives. There's the prior learning, so connecting to the prior learning. So all of that is done before you're teaching the new material. Then during the learning sequence where you're getting the new material and you're trying to help the students lay that down in their thinking, their long-term memory, this is what you do. You present the content, you provide guidance about the content, and then you practice. And you can start to see the common threads with Rosenshine's work, right? Because there's clearly influence from Gagne's work into Rosenshine's work. Then of course we look at the after learning event practices. This involves providing feedback, assessing performance, and then retention and transfer. So that's really speaking about the idea of consolidating that information into knowledge and embedding it into long-term memory and transferring it to different novel tasks so that we can take our learning from that very specific context in which we encountered the information and transfer it over to new and novel situations so that it can be applied and generalized learning. Now let's have a look at some of the meso or middle level interventions. These include retrieval practice and deep and meaningful questioning. So let's have a look at a few definitions of the term retrieval practice just in case you haven't encountered that term before. But I have to say it's currently very much in vogue amongst educators at the moment and it's going through that hype cycle. But let's have a look at some of these definitions by gurus from the field of the learning sciences. So Weinstein and colleagues suggested that retrieval practice is bringing information to mind from your long-term memory. So it's a very basic activity, but it's about an active form of learning, not a passive form of learning. Another definition is by Pooja Agarwal. She's a cognitive scientist and associate professor at Berkeley College in Boston, and she said that retrieval practice is an active attempt by a student to recall or recognize and then subsequently reconstruct their memory of knowledge during initial learning. So the idea of retrieval practice involves at least 3 crucial steps. Number 1 is reaching into long-term memory. Number 2 is pulling that information or that knowledge out of long-term memory. And number 3 is repeating this process until mastery is achieved. So by going through those steps over and over again, you strengthen the memory, and so you increase the probability that you successfully retrieve that memory in future. And you might add a 4th element to that and say once mastery has been achieved, that you can have distributed practice opportunities where you can retrieve that information from time to time to ensure that you strengthen and maintain that memory. Now, if you're a bit of a statistics nerd like myself, you might be interested in the effect sizes from some of the latest meta-analyses which help organize and summarize and average the results from a series of individual studies on a similar topic. They've had at least 3 meta-analyses on what is called the testing effect and retrieval practice in the last sort of 4 or 5 years. So I've got them on screen. And what you'll see is that all of them sort of hover around between 0.4 and 0.5. So a moderate to large effect in the educational literature or educational parlance, you'd say that's a moderate to large standardized effect there with Cohen's d, which essentially means that there's going to be a medium to large effect on academic achievement in the classroom if you engage in these strategies regularly. So what are some of the ways that we can engage in retrieval practice frequently in our classrooms and when we're educating our students? Well, I've listed about 14 there on screen, and I'm sure you can list your own strategies as well. Essentially, if it follows those principles of bringing that longer term information to the front of your mind and applying that and testing that knowledge, sort of actively bringing it to the front of your mind regularly and testing it for accuracy, then that meets the criteria for retrieval practice. Okay, so let's now talk about this idea of deep and meaningful questioning. Where did the history of this notion of effective questioning as a pedagogical framework come from? Well, I think we can look back to ancient Athens and Greece and see it in the Socratic method of teaching. And one of the effective strategies in the Socratic method was asking questions to promote deeper and deeper insight on part of the learner. So let's have a quick look at what the features of the Socratic questioning method are. Socratic questioning asks an open-ended question that the student knows how to answer, redirects attention to insights about the issue that have previously evaded discussion, moves the student from specific details to abstract principles, so lower to higher order thinking, and helps the student apply these principles to revise or elaborate their previous knowledge about a topic or concept. Now, the Socratic method is not the only effective method to stimulate deep and meaningful questioning in the classroom. Let's have a look at some more research. There was an interesting paper that I found by Hennessy and colleagues in 2023 that looked at high versus low attainment dialogue in the classroom. So, what were the features of the high attainment dialogue? Students who achieved high attainment in their classroom were engaging in dialogue that involved elaboration and inviting students to elaborate, querying or handling disagreements and making negative evaluations effectively. They were looking at task design and the use of knowledge artifacts like sticking cards into a number line. They're looking at classroom ethos as well. So what are some of the beliefs that are going around the room and what are some of the thoughts around effective dialogue? So for example, stressing that it is important to have a go rather than to remain silent and risk offence. And I like this model that also comes from the same research laboratory. Let's have a look. This was originally based on the work of Howe and colleagues in 2019, and it talks about this idea of student participation, active participation in dialogue in the classroom. They talked about various elaborations and querying approaches, and they say that elaborations involve inviting or promoting elaboration, building on clarification or evaluation of previous contributions made by oneself or others. And then the querying that teachers can do, it just involves querying and challenging or disagreeing with others' ideas. But this isn't to say that we disagree by shutting people down, because there are ways to disagree agreeably, and it's a real art form that some of these teachers, these high impact teachers, master in the classroom. And I would point to the work of Cambridge University and their T-Cedar project, led by people like Neil Mercer, these gurus on dialogue in the classroom and effective dialogue in the classroom, including but going beyond effective questioning. So I encourage you to check out their work if you get a chance. Now, one final study that I found quite compelling was this idea of asking questions to promote higher order thinking or lower order thinking. Let's have a look at this study. It was by Tynkin and colleagues in 2009. So they said that questions can either be productive or reproductive. So a productive question is a question that provides students the opportunity to create, analyze, or evaluate. Whereas a reproductive question prompts students to imitate, recall, or apply knowledge and information taught by the teacher. So they're representing the same knowledge that they received, they're just giving it back to the teacher in the same form. One thing that I found that was quite interesting in this paper was that they looked at how these types of questions interacted with teacher experience. And what we see in the results is a massive difference. So as we can see in this table, 32% of experienced teachers asked productive questions and only 15% of novice teachers asked productive questions. And of course, we see the inverse of that with the reproductive questions. So what we see here is that experience does lead to more expertise in teaching. However, I would point to the fact that there must be something about that experience that is improving those teachers, the teacher's ability to ask more meaningful and deeper questions with their students. And if we can identify that effectively with enough precision, we should be able to impart the knowledge to younger, more inexperienced teachers so they can replicate that expertise from the get-go rather than having to wait 10, 15 years to be effective teachers and effective questioners of their students in the classroom. Now, sometimes it can help to compare and contrast between more effective questioning methods and less effective questioning methods. So what I'll do is I'll briefly put on screen a compare and contrast table that shows to the left of screen more effective questioning techniques and to the right of screen less effective questioning techniques. So press pause on the screen if you want to kind of go through those now. Now, one thing that might interest you is that Rosenshine was certainly not a one-trick pony. He had a long and illustrious career in the field of educational psychology and made many distinct and important contributions to the field. one of the big reviews that was a hallmark study in the field of effective questioning was this review, this meta-analysis on studies that looked at how effective it was for students to generate their own questions, right? And he looked at that. So this is called the generation effect, when a student generates their own questions, for example, before they start to engage in prescribed reading. So if they're asked to read a chapter of a textbook, first of all, you want them to go through a process where they start to list out their own questions of what they want to learn from that textbook. He also found in this review that the most effective questions were more general in nature, so more open-ended questions rather than the closed, discrete answer questions. And when students were given an opportunity to ask their own questions, but also to ask their peers questions, so the whole each one teach one, so asking and answering questions between peers, engages in this peer-to-peer teaching process, which we know can be quite effective at times, particularly in a more advanced part of the learning sequence where students have good foundational knowledge. Otherwise, if it happens at the beginning of the learning sequence when students have a low level of knowledge, peer-to-peer teaching is not very good. It ends up being something akin to the blind leading the blind. So I want to just be a little bit cautious of that conclusion there. But nevertheless, it's important for students to engage in meaningful interactions with their peers and socialize this aspect of the generation effect in creating questions, generating questions themselves, and then seeking answers themselves, and then in a social peer-to-peer setting. All right, it's time to dig down into the micro-level interventions. So these are the highly contextualized specific interventions, and we're going to look at two different examples here. This is mathematics skills and reading skills. So let's start with the reading skills. Now, the field of reading is absolutely replete with incredible science. So it's one of the most rich fields for the learning sciences, and it's been going on for well over 100 years. And the experts in that field have converged on several principles that will lead to improvements in learning. Let's have a look. That involves explicit instruction for phonemic awareness, systematic phonics instruction, methods to improve fluency, ways to enhance comprehension, building vocabulary, and oral language. And I've grabbed some of these ideas from the Australian Educational Research Organisation's excellent work, as well as some of the wonderful work from the Institute of Educational Sciences and the What Works Clearinghouse to inform this piece. Now, if you are interested in the science of reading, you cannot look past Scarborouggh's work. In 2001, he wrote a book chapter that was a hallmark chapter, I think, in the field because it provided an excellent sort of visual representation of what it means to be an effective reader. Let's have a look at it. He talked about this idea of a reading rope, and it had two big strands that came together with 7 smaller strands. One of the big strands was word recognition, which involved phonological awareness, decoding and sight words. And the other big strand was language comprehension. That involved background knowledge, vocabulary, language structure, verbal reasoning, and literacy. And I strongly encourage you to read Scarborough's work and his colleagues Newman and Dixon if you want to go deeper into that rabbit hole. Now let's look at some of the effective mathematics instructional approaches from the Institute of Educational Sciences. In one of their reviews, or their educator practice guides, they've recommended 3 things based on the evidence. Recommendation 1 was use solved problems to engage students in analysing algebraic reasoning and strategies. Recommendation 2 was to teach students to utilise the structure of algebraic representations. Recommendation 3 was to teach students to intentionally choose from alternative algebraic strategies when solving problems. So this idea of having many pathways to succeed in maths is very important, and sort of like deconstructing the problem. So almost like the engineering mindset where you start to tinker with things, you deconstruct an engine, then you put it back together, and that's how you learn to understand it. Well, mathematical equations and functions can be done in the same way. There are different ways to put that equation together. There are different ways to deconstruct it and solve problems. And this seems to be very effective in this field of mathematics. But of course, pointing back to the model, these are very much contextualized interventions. So they're domain specific to mathematics. They will not transfer to other types of teaching. at least not very well. And so these, as we can see, are not generalized principles, not so much as the macro principles that you see in Gagne's 9 events of instruction or in Rosenshine's 10 or 17 principles of effective instruction. Now, I did manage to find a recent meta-analysis that looks into this idea of mathematical instruction approaches that are more effective with students who have mathematical learning difficulties. So if you work with students with learning difficulties, in particular with mathematics learning difficulties, this may interest you. Let's have a quick look. They found that systematic instruction always worked best, so not just a willy-nilly way of instructing, but a system of logical steps. Clear and concise mathematics language, so not giving too much jargon or verbose language. Multiple visual representations, perhaps even to see that there are real-life examples that students can see of the mathematical concepts or differences in numbers. Using number lines was also effective for these students. Targeted instruction on word problem solving, so word problem solving to be able to formulate that into a mathematical equation or to transfer a mathematical equation into a word problem are 2 different sets of skills. So you need one to bridge the 2, and it's very helpful to go through that actual set of skills with students. The last one is doing timed activities, and that's really just speaking to this idea of improving fluency. So when they've achieved accuracy in the mathematical process that you're trying to teach them, it's going through it over and over again until they've got a state of mastery and fluency with the material. So that's automatic, automatic, automatic. Now, I did promise you a bit of a bonus round in this model, and this speaks to this idea of metacognitive strategies where students can become their own teachers. So I've put that as the overarching theme of these interventions because ultimately one of the big goals of a teacher is to help their students become their own teachers and make their job redundant in the process. So you're really handing over the keys so a student can drive their own learning. So what does it mean to be a metacognitive learner? Let's have a closer look. The High Impact Teaching Strategies document from the Victorian Department of Education suggests that, in a sense, teaching metacognitive strategies entails teaching students to teach themselves. And I mentioned this in one of my previous videos that there are several meta-analyses and large reviews that point to the strength of implementing metacognitive interventions. And I'll get into the specifics about what you can do to improve metacognitive thinking in your classroom. But before we do, let's look at some of the evidence. A meta-analysis by DeBoer and colleagues found a moderate effect, that is a standardized mean difference of 0.5 on academic achievement, and that increased during long-term follow-up. So the gains were not only retained, but they increased, suggesting that when you teach a student to learn how to learn or to teach themselves, there is a positive feedback loop. Right? And that's the ultimate goal, is to help them to become their own teacher. And it's good to know that the research validates that, because in long-term follow-up, the students have been teaching themselves, or else we wouldn't have seen that big boost in their academic achievement after the intervention from the teacher stops. So very powerful stuff. Let's continue to have a look. And I think another one that is worthy of a mention is this study by Creed and Phillips in 2011, because it was a large review on what is the most popular questionnaire or survey on the metacognitive skills that we want our students to develop. It's called the Metacognitive Strategies for Learning questionnaire. And they found that that questionnaire and the results on that questionnaire have a moderate correlation with grade point average in college students. So that's showing us that metacognitive strategies go up, so too do grades in the student's college GPA or grade point average. So, and the same also holds in reverse, that if the student's metacognitive strategies go down or they don't develop them well in the first place, the grade point average isn't so good. It goes down with that. Now, I've spoken a little bit in general terms here. Let's dig down into some more concrete steps about what you can do to improve metacognition in the classroom. One of the things, the sort of top-down approaches that I would recommend, is to create systems of habits to prompt and predispose students to effectively source, monitor, plan, and regulate their own learning. All right, so there's a system in place to help students source, monitor, plan, and regulate their own learning. That's a culture that you create in your classroom. You cultivate those habits with your students. What does that look like? That means giving your students an appetite to constantly check their own learning. Right? So do learning checks all the time. How do we do that? That's with tests and quizzes and externalizing our knowledge and skills so that they're not just sitting there dormant in our minds, because all great ideas survive up until they're brought out into reality. And we want our students to know that. We want them to know where their strengths and their deficiencies are so they can work on those and leverage those. The literature on metacognition is very clear on the idea that when you improve the metacognitive cues that you get, that is to inform your judgments of learning, so that I can look at a test result and say, hey, this is where I stack up against that measure of knowledge and skills. That's an external objective cue. Instead of using my intuitions to judge my own learning, I'm using an external objective cue to give me some feedback about what I know and what I need to work on, what I don't know. All right, and there's an excellent book. I highly recommend it. Just bear with me for one sec. This book, when I read it, it completely transformed my mind and made me fall in love with the field of metacognition. It's by Janet Metcalf and John Dunlosky. It's been updated since I got this copy in 2009, but I highly recommend it. It's just simply called Metacognition. So not a very creative title, but it goes through the ins and outs of all of this sort of thing in more detail. So highly recommend that. Then there's this idea of providing your students metacognitive feedback. So how do we do that? Well, one of the frameworks that you can sort of cultivate in your classroom whenever you engage in feedback is to ask the Hattie and Timperley questions. And they wrote this famous paper, the most cited paper in all of educational research, called The Power of Feedback. And they talked about this idea of feedback allowing a student to answer 3 questions. Where am I at? Where am I going? And how can I get there? And then Black and William came along a couple of years later and really expanded that by saying it's not only the student who can ask, where am I at, where am I going, and how can I get there? It's also the students between themselves can ask each other that. So a peer-to-peer feedback process to promote metacognitive awareness amongst students in the classroom. Not only that, but a student to teacher and teacher to student dynamic. So at least 3 exchanges of feedback going on in the classroom to promote that metacognitive awareness of what we know and can do, our knowledge and skills. Right? And so teacher to student, student to teacher, peer to peer, so pupil to pupil and amongst each other, and then unto ourselves. So giving ourselves feedback, asking those questions. If feedback cannot answer those 3 questions of where am I at, where am I going, and how am I going to take the steps to get there, then it's not effective feedback. So it's a really important way to promote metacognitive feedback in the classroom. I highly recommend it. Now there's plenty of other strategies we can use to promote metacognition in the classroom. I'm just going to put up on screen a bit of a laundry list of some of the strategies that you can use for your students and they can use for themselves, and some strategies that you can use as an educator to promote metacognition in your classroom. Now I've underlined those top ones, so I'll just read them out. That it's to make learning visible, and that of course taps into this idea that John Hattie has made famous, that is, you don't know that you're teaching someone unless they are learning, and you don't know that they are learning unless you've got some way of seeing what they've learned. You can see changes in their knowledge and skills as demonstrated through some kind of externalization of that knowledge and skills. Don't trust gut feelings. Too many times we trust our intuitions, and there's a whole lot of literature pointing to the fact that our intuitions are often biased, typically in the direction of overconfidence, and that's called the overconfidence effect. You can also look up the hard-easy effect or the Dunning and Kruger effect. There's been some scrutiny of those ideas in recent years. However, there's still something to them. There's a bit of truth in them. And they all point to this idea that we can often have incredible bias in our judgments of our own learning. So don't trust your own gut instincts. For this particular approach, this metacognitive approach to learning, we want to use objective evidence to verify what we think we know and can do, to verify our learning and our judgments of learning. Now, shifting from the students to what teachers can do to promote metacognition in the classroom, the teachers can constantly work on knowing their own impact by making learning visible and tasks that promote visible learning amongst their learners. The next thing they can do is to not trust their own gut instincts. So teachers, we know that students often make misjudgments of their own learning. Well, teachers can make misjudgments of their students' learning. They might estimate that their student knows more than they actually know, or they might underestimate their students. So we want to check and perform assessment to get a more accurate representation of what our students learning is like and what their knowledge and skills are. Now, a few years ago, Sean Kang and myself updated this document from the Educational Endowment Foundation and situated it into an Australian context. It's called the Metacognition and Self-Regulated Learning Guidance Report, and we were commissioned to do that for the Evidence for Learning group. I recommend you check it out. It's got 7 recommendations here up on screen that you can read through. If you want to know more, just Google the name of the document. Now, I'll finish up with a quote from my mentor, my friend, my old boss, John Hattie, who said this about metacognition and self-regulated learning. He said, "The remarkable feature of evidence is that the biggest effects on student learning occur when teachers become learners of their own teaching and when students become their own teachers. When students become their own teachers, they exhibit the self-regulatory attributes that seem most desirable for learners. That is, self-monitoring, self-evaluation, self-assessment, and self-teaching." Okay, so that's all the information overload that I'm going to give you for today. Let's do a quick recap. The first thing we looked at was the typology of teaching and learning interventions. We talked about the triple M model, the macro, the bigger picture stuff, the more generic interventions, so Rosenshine and Gagne's instructional models. Then we talked about the meso or middle level. These are more generalizable than specific strategies, but nevertheless they're less generalizable and less applicable to broader classroom experiences than the macro framework there. These were retrieval practice and deep and meaningful questioning at that middle layer. At the micro layer, we looked at things that were highly specialized to that domain of learning, such as reading skills and mathematics skills. Right, so these things don't transfer very well to teaching in other domains, but nevertheless, they're research informed. They're backed by the science of learning and teaching. So they're highly recommended, but only for those specific, highly contextualized domains of knowledge. Then we had the bonus round with the metacognitive interventions, which essentially anchors around this idea of helping our students become their own teachers, teaching them to be able to teach themselves. So if you're interested in extending your knowledge, I recommend that you check out the next episode, which is how to create the ultimate teacher toolkit. That's going to be looking into some of the credible resources from the science of learning and evidence-based teaching that are going to help supercharge your teaching. Now that's about all we have time for. Thank you so much for watching. If you got value from watching this episode, please hit the like button. And if you don't want to miss out on future episodes, subscribe to the channel. I look forward to seeing you next time. Thank you.